It was 1930 when Carl Jung made a discovery that would forever change our understanding of spirituality and the crisis of the modern soul. He realized that when traditional religious structures begin to lose their power over the human mind, something much deeper and more urgent awakens in the collective psyche. If this speaks to your experience, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support helps us explore these profound insights that can transform how you understand spirituality and your own soul's journey. Jung perceived that when organized religion starts to crumble, the soul doesn't simply accept secular emptiness. Instead, it begins a desperate search for authentic spiritual experience, for direct connection with the sacred, for meaning that transcends the material world. He called this the return of the repressed religious function, and he believed it would define the spiritual landscape of our time. If you felt spiritually homeless in recent years, if traditional religion no longer speaks to your deepest questions, if you sense something profound missing from modern life despite all our progress and prosperity, then you need to understand what Jung discovered about this spiritual crisis and why he saw it not as decline, but as necessary transformation. Jung recognized that we are living through the collapse of religious certainty, the breakdown of spiritual authority, and the dissolution of mythological frameworks that once gave human life meaning and direction. But rather than seeing this as tragedy, Jung understood it as an inevitable stage in the evolution of human consciousness, a necessary death that precedes spiritual rebirth. You see, Jung understood that organized religion serves crucial psychological functions. It provides collective containers for the numinous shared structures that help people connect with transcendent experience. But he also recognized that these containers naturally become rigid over time, more concerned with preserving institutional power than facilitating genuine spiritual encounter. When you look around today, you can see exactly what Jung predicted unfolding. Traditional religious institutions are losing influence over younger generations. Church attendance continues declining. Biblical literalism struggles against educated minds. Religious authority faces constant questioning. The old certainties no longer comfort or guide people navigating modern complexity. But here's what Jung realized that most observers miss. This collapse isn't happening because people have become less spiritual. It's happening because people are becoming more spiritually mature, more psychologically sophisticated, more demanding of authentic rather than inherited spiritual experience. The soul, Jung discovered, has its own intelligence, its own evolutionary trajectory, its own capacity for growth that transcends institutional boundaries. When external religious structures become too small, too limiting, too disconnected from genuine spiritual reality, the soul begins demanding something larger, deeper, more authentic. This is why you might find yourself drawn to meditation practices from Eastern traditions, to psychological approaches that honor the sacred, to nature-based spiritualities that connect you directly with divine presence in the world around you. Your soul isn't rejecting spirituality. It's rejecting spiritual containers that have become inadequate for your expanding consciousness. Jung called this phenomenon the return of the repressed religious function. When organized religion fails to nourish the soul's deepest needs, those needs don't disappear. They go underground, seeking new forms of expression, new pathways to the sacred, new ways of connecting with transcendent dimensions of existence. But here's where Jung's insight becomes crucial for your spiritual journey. He discovered that this return doesn't happen automatically or easily. It requires conscious participation in what he called the renewal process. You cannot simply wait for new spiritual forms to emerge. You must become an active participant in creating them. This is why so many people today feel spiritually lost, caught between religious forms that no longer serve them and new spiritual possibilities that haven't yet fully crystallized. They've left the old containers but haven't learned to create new ones. They've rejected inherited spirituality but haven't discovered how to cultivate authentic spiritual experience. Jung realized this transition period is inherently difficult and disorienting. Old maps no longer work, but new territory hasn't been fully explored. Familiar guideposts have lost meaning, but new forms of spiritual guidance haven't been established. It's like existing between worlds, no longer belonging to inherited frameworks, but not yet at home in whatever comes next. If this describes your experience, Jung would tell you that you're not spiritually deficient or lost. You're participating in one of the most important transitions in human spiritual evolution. You're part of the generation called to discover what authentic spirituality looks like when freed from institutional control and reconnected with direct spiritual experience. But Jung also warned about dangers in this transition. When people lose connection to traditional spiritual containers without developing new ones, they become vulnerable to what he called spiritual inflation, unconscious identification with spiritual energies they haven't learned to integrate properly. You see this everywhere today, people who reject organized religion but become dogmatically attached to alternative spiritual practices. People claiming to be spiritual but not religious, while displaying the same rigid thinking they rejected in traditional believers. People pursuing spiritual experiences without developing psychological maturity to integrate them wisely. Jung understood that genuine spiritual renewal requires more than rejecting old forms. It demands developing what he called religious consciousness, the capacity to recognize and relate to sacred dimensions of existence in ways that honor both psychological truth and spiritual reality. This religious consciousness isn't about believing specific doctrines or following particular practices. It's about developing inner capacity to perceive meaning, experience reverence, connect with something larger than individual ego, recognize mysterious and sacred dimensions of ordinary existence. Jung discovered this capacity emerges through what he called the individuation process, the psychological journey toward wholeness that integrates conscious and unconscious aspects of personality. As you become more psychologically complete, you naturally develop greater capacity for authentic spiritual experience. But here's what's revolutionary about Jung's approach to spirituality. He realized the soul's demand for renewal isn't just personal, it's collective. The spiritual crisis we're experiencing isn't just about individuals losing faith, it's about our entire culture being called to evolve beyond spiritual forms that no longer serve our highest development. This means your personal spiritual journey isn't just about individual salvation or enlightenment. It's about participating in creating new spiritual possibilities for humanity as a whole. Your willingness to question inherited beliefs, explore new spiritual territories, develop authentic religious consciousness contributes to collective spiritual evolution of our species. Jung believed we are living through what he called a spiritual renaissance, a period when human consciousness is being called to discover new levels of spiritual sophistication and authenticity. But this renaissance won't happen automatically. It requires individuals willing to do inner work necessary to become spiritually mature, psychologically integrated, and capable of creating new forms of sacred experience. This is why your spiritual seeking matters so profoundly. Your questioning of traditional forms isn't rebellion or loss of faith, but participation in necessary evolutionary process. Your hunger for authentic spiritual experience is actually a calling to help create spiritual forms that future generations will inherit. But Jung understood this calling comes with specific challenges and responsibilities. Because you're operating without established spiritual authority support, you need to develop greater discernment, deeper self-knowledge, and more sophisticated understanding of psychological and spiritual processes. You cannot simply adopt whatever spiritual practice appeals without understanding how it affects psychological development. You cannot pursue spiritual experiences without developing capacity to integrate them into daily life. You cannot reject all spiritual authority without developing your own inner authority and wisdom. Jung developed specific practices for what he called befriending the unconscious in spiritual contexts. The first is what he called symbolic amplification applied to spiritual experience. Instead of taking spiritual insights literally or dismissing them as fantasy, you learn to recognize symbolic and metaphorical dimensions that connect personal experience with universal spiritual themes. When you encounter powerful dreams with spiritual imagery, meaningful synchronicities that seem to carry messages, or creative inspirations that feel divinely guided, Jung would encourage exploring these through the lens of archetypal symbolism, cross-cultural spiritual wisdom, and your own psychological development. This isn't about imposing predetermined meanings on experience. It's about learning to perceive multi-layered significance naturally present in spiritual material. Your soul communicates through symbols because symbols carry complex meanings that ordinary language cannot express. The second practice Jung developed is what he called active imagination in spiritual contexts. Instead of passively waiting for spiritual experiences or depending entirely on external practices, you learn to actively cultivate states of consciousness receptive to spiritual insight and connection. This involves developing what Jung called concentrated attention, the ability to focus awareness in ways that make you sensitive to subtle spiritual dimensions of experience. It might involve meditation practices that quiet mental chatter and open awareness to deeper consciousness levels. It might involve contemplative practices that help perceive sacred qualities present in ordinary experience. But Jung emphasized these practices shouldn't be pursued as escapes from psychological reality or ordinary life responsibilities. Authentic spiritual development integrates transcendent awareness with psychological maturity and practical effectiveness. The goal isn't becoming otherworldly, but bringing spiritual insight into this world in ways that enhance both personal development and collective well-being. The third practice Jung recommended is what he called creative expression of the religious function. He discovered authentic spiritual development requires creative outlets that allow the soul to express deepest insights and experiences in tangible form. This might mean writing poetry that captures spiritual insights, creating art that expresses sense of the sacred, composing music that embodies spiritual feelings, or developing philosophical frameworks that integrate spiritual and psychological understanding. Jung realized the religious function of the psyche is inherently creative. When it cannot express itself through traditional religious forms, it seeks creative outlets that allow authentic spiritual expression. By consciously providing these outlets, you facilitate healthy development of spiritual life while contributing to collective creation of new spiritual forms. Now I want to share with you the most transformative discovery Jung made about the soul's demand for renewal, something that will fundamentally change how you understand not just your personal spiritual journey, but your role in the greatest transformation of human consciousness in recorded history. Jung realized that we are living through what he called the democratization of spiritual experience, a time when direct access to the sacred is becoming available to ordinary individuals rather than being mediated through religious institutions and clerical authorities. For the first time in human history, large numbers of people have the psychological sophistication, educational background, and cultural freedom to explore spirituality as conscious adults rather than inheriting it as unconscious tradition. This represents an evolutionary leap in human spiritual development that Jung believed would ultimately produce forms of religious consciousness far more mature and authentic than anything previously known. But he also understood that this transition requires individuals capable of navigating spiritual territory without traditional maps, guides, or safety nets. Jung discovered that this democratization of spiritual experience operates through what he called the transcendent function applied to spiritual development. Just as this function synthesizes opposing psychological forces into higher forms of understanding, it can integrate wisdom from traditional spiritual forms with insights from modern psychological development to create something genuinely new and more complete. This spiritual transcendent function emerges through what Jung called conscious relationship with the numinous, active engagement with spiritual energies and insights rather than passive reception of inherited beliefs. You become a conscious participant in your spiritual development rather than a follower of external authority. Jung found that this conscious spiritual participation naturally develops what he called autonomous religious consciousness, the capacity for authentic spiritual experience that doesn't depend on external validation or institutional approval. You develop an inner spiritual compass that can guide your development without requiring permission from religious authorities. But Jung discovered that this autonomous religious consciousness comes with profound responsibility. When you're no longer constrained by traditional religious boundaries, you must develop much greater discernment about spiritual energies, practices, and insights. You become responsible for distinguishing between authentic spiritual guidance and psychological projection, between genuine transcendent experience and spiritual bypassing. Jung developed specific criteria for what he called spiritual discernment in the age of renewal. Authentic spiritual experience enhances, rather than diminishes, psychological integration. It increases your capacity for love, wisdom, and effective action in the world, rather than creating withdrawal from ordinary life responsibilities. Genuine spiritual insight connects you more deeply with your authentic self and life purpose, rather than creating inflation or grandiosity. Real spiritual development makes you more humble and compassionate rather than more special or superior. True spiritual experience increases your capacity to serve others rather than focusing entirely on personal salvation or enlightenment. Jung realized that when spiritual seeking meets these criteria, it becomes what he called collaborative spiritual development, the recognition that individual spiritual growth and collective spiritual evolution are intimately connected. Your personal spiritual development contributes to the spiritual possibilities available to humanity as a whole. This collaborative perspective transforms spiritual seeking from individual pursuit into collective service. Instead of developing spiritually for personal benefit alone, you recognize that your spiritual maturity contributes to the pool of conscious awareness available to our entire species. Jung discovered that this collective dimension of spiritual development naturally leads to what he called spiritual creativity, the impulse to create new forms of spiritual expression that serve not just personal development, but collective spiritual evolution. You become a conscious participant in creating the spiritual possibilities that future generations will inherit. This spiritual creativity might manifest as developing new approaches to meditation or prayer, creating art that facilitates spiritual experience, writing that integrates spiritual and psychological insights, or building communities that support authentic spiritual development without becoming dogmatic or exclusive. But Jung emphasized that this spiritual creativity must emerge from genuine spiritual development rather than ego ambition or desire for spiritual authority. The most powerful spiritual innovations often come from individuals who have done deep inner work and developed authentic spiritual maturity rather than from those seeking to establish themselves as spiritual teachers or leaders. Jung found that authentic spiritual creativity naturally develops what he called integrated spiritual consciousness, awareness that honors both transcendent and psychological dimensions of human experience. This integrated consciousness avoids both spiritual bypassing and psychological reductionism, recognizing that complete human development requires both spiritual awakening and psychological maturity. This integrated approach resolves what Jung called the spirituality paradox. The more genuinely spiritual you become, the more psychologically grounded and practically effective you often become. The more transcendent your awareness, the more present and engaged you often become with ordinary life circumstances. Jung discovered that this integration happens through what he called the marriage of heaven and earth within individual consciousness, the recognition that spiritual and material dimensions of existence are complementary rather than contradictory aspects of complete human experience. This marriage manifests as what Jung called practical spirituality, spiritual awareness that enhances rather than escapes from engagement with work, relationships, creativity, and service in the world. Your spiritual development becomes a source of wisdom and energy for more effective and compassionate engagement with life circumstances, rather than withdrawal from them. But Jung also recognized that this practical spirituality requires what he called spiritual stamina, the capacity to maintain spiritual awareness and practice even when external circumstances are challenging or when spiritual experiences are not immediately forthcoming. Authentic spiritual development requires consistency and perseverance rather than dependence on peak experiences or favorable conditions. Jung found that this spiritual stamina develops through what he called faith in the process, trust that spiritual development unfolds according to its own timing and rhythm, rather than according to ego preferences or external expectations. This faith allows you to continue spiritual practice and development even during periods when results are not immediately visible. This faith in the process becomes the foundation for what Jung called sustainable spiritual development, spiritual growth that continues throughout your lifetime rather than being dependent on particular circumstances, teachers, or peak experiences. You develop a mature relationship with spiritual development that can weather both successes and setbacks, both periods of expansion and periods of integration. Jung realized that this sustainable spiritual development naturally leads to what he called wisdom transmission, the capacity to share spiritual insights and support others' spiritual development without creating dependency or claiming spiritual authority inappropriately. This wisdom transmission happens not through preaching or teaching, but through embodiment, living in ways that demonstrate the practical benefits of authentic spiritual development. Your life becomes a demonstration of what's possible when spiritual awareness is integrated with psychological maturity and practical effectiveness. Jung found that people who develop this integrated spiritual consciousness often become what he called bridges between worlds, individuals capable of translating between different spiritual traditions, between spiritual and secular perspectives, between transcendent insights and practical applications. These bridge individuals play crucial roles in the spiritual renaissance Jung envisioned, helping to create new forms of spiritual community and practice that honor both individual spiritual autonomy and collective spiritual wisdom. But Jung emphasized that becoming a bridge between worlds requires ongoing commitment to both spiritual development and psychological integration. You cannot effectively serve this function while remaining unconscious of your own psychological patterns or while pursuing spiritual development as escape from psychological work. The ultimate vision Jung had for spiritual renewal is what he called collaborative spiritual evolution, networks of spiritually mature individuals working together to create new possibilities for authentic spiritual experience while supporting each other's continued development. These collaborative networks wouldn't be traditional religious organizations with fixed hierarchies and dogmatic beliefs. They would be fluid, creative communities of spiritual explorers supporting each other's development while contributing to the ongoing creation of spiritual possibilities that serve both individual growth and collective evolution. Your spiritual seeking isn't just about personal fulfillment or enlightenment, it's about participating in this larger creative process. Your willingness to question inherited spiritual forms, explore new spiritual territories, develop autonomous religious consciousness, contributes to the emergence of these collaborative spiritual possibilities. If you've recognized yourself in this exploration of spiritual renewal and want to deepen your understanding of how to navigate this transition skillfully, I want you to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications for more insights that can support your spiritual and psychological development. Share this video with others who might be feeling spiritually homeless or caught between traditional religion and authentic spiritual experience. Sometimes, the most powerful healing happens when we realize our spiritual seeking is part of a larger evolutionary process that others are navigating too. And leave a comment sharing your own experience with spiritual renewal. What traditional religious forms have you outgrown? What new spiritual insights have you discovered? How are you learning to create authentic spiritual experience that honors both your psychological truth and your soul's deepest needs? Because Jung's ultimate message about spiritual renewal is this: the collapse of traditional religion isn't the end of spirituality. It's the beginning of spirituality's next evolutionary phase. The soul's demand for renewal isn't a crisis to be solved, but a calling to be answered. Your spiritual homelessness isn't a permanent condition, but a transitional phase, preparing you to become a conscious participant in creating humanity's spiritual future. Stop waiting for someone else to create the spiritual forms you need. Start developing the psychological and spiritual maturity necessary to create them yourself, in collaboration with others who share your commitment to authentic spiritual development. The future of human spirituality depends on individuals like you having the courage to move beyond inherited beliefs and discover what genuine spiritual experience looks like when it emerges from conscious development rather than unconscious tradition.